The Jamaican government has intensified consultations on the legal and administrative framework governing the religious use of cannabis, as authorities seek to protect the sacramental rights of Rastafarians while preventing the system from being used to support unauthorized commercial activity. The review is examining how recognized Rastafarian organizations may possess, cultivate, transport, and use ganja for bona fide religious purposes. It also seeks to clarify the responsibilities of the ministries, regulatory bodies, and law enforcement agencies involved in administering the framework. One of the most significant proposals under consideration is the transfer of operational responsibility for sacramental cannabis matters to the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport. The framework has traditionally been administered through the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, but officials believe its strong connection to Jamaica's religious and cultural heritage may make the Culture Ministry a more appropriate institutional home. No final decision on the proposed transfer has yet been announced. The matter will form part of the continuing consultation process. The latest round of discussions took place during a high-level policy meeting at the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs in Kingston. The talks involved Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs Delroy Chuck, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports Olivia Babsy Grange, Minister of State in the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs Marissa Dalrymple Filbert, and Minister of State in the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce Delana Seawright. Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce, Sansia Bennett Templar, and senior technical officials from the participating ministries were also involved. The consultation followed recommendations from the Cannabis Industry Development Task Force, which is chaired by Seawright. The task force identified the need for greater policy clarity, more consistent administration, and stronger cooperation among the agencies responsible for the sacramental framework. According to the government, the objective is to modernize the system without weakening the legal protections granted to members of the Rastafarian community. The government remains committed to protecting legitimate religious rights whilst ensuring that the framework is properly governed, clearly understood, and not exploited for activities outside of the law, Seawright said. The state minister added that the protections contained in the Dangerous Drugs Act must be maintained while the authorities address operational challenges, improve compliance, and create a clearer separation between religious and commercial cannabis activities. The talks are expected to address several unresolved or potentially confusing aspects of the framework. Among the major issues being examined are the criteria used to recognize eligible Rastafarian organizations, the process for designating individuals and religious bodies, the lands on which ganja may legally be cultivated for sacramental purposes, the recognition and oversight of Rastafarian places of worship, cultivation and possession limits, rules governing the transportation of sacramental cannabis, record keeping, monitoring, and regulatory oversight, police enforcement procedures, the prevention of cannabis grown for religious purposes entering the commercial market, and the coordination among the Culture Ministry, Justice Ministry, Cannabis Licensing Authority, and Jamaica Constabulary Force. These issues are important because the sacramental framework does not create an unrestricted right to cultivate, transport, sell, or distribute cannabis. Its protections apply within a defined religious context and remain subject to conditions established under Jamaican law. Officials are therefore attempting to establish rules that are clear enough to be understood by Rastafarian organizations, police officers, regulators, and the wider public. Jamaica's cannabis laws were significantly amended in 2015. Those reforms changed the treatment of possession of small quantities of ganja and formally recognized its sacramental use by members of the Rastafarian faith. Under the general decriminalization provision, possession of 2 ounces or less of ganja is no longer treated as an arrestable criminal offense. It may instead attract a ticket and does not result in a criminal conviction. The general provision, however, is separate from the specific protection for religious use. Section 7C of the Dangerous Drugs Act makes provision for possession and use of ganja by members of the Rastafarian community for religious purposes as a sacrament, in accordance with the Rastafarian faith. The law also establishes mechanisms under which places of Rastafarian worship and lands used for sacramental cultivation may be formally recognized. The government's present review is not an announcement of unrestricted cannabis legalization. Neither does it place a religious framework under the same system as licensed commercial cannabis businesses. Instead, the process is intended to clarify how the existing protections should operate in practice. The consultations are also examining the operation of the Dangerous Drugs Act, designation of land for cultivation of ganja for sacramental purposes, Amendment Order 2023. That order allows recognized Rastafarian organizations and designated individuals to cultivate ganja for genuine religious purposes on approved lands, subject to specified conditions and regulatory oversight. The designation of land is intended to provide a lawful route for recognized religious communities to produce cannabis required for sacramental observances. It is not a general cultivation license and does not authorize cannabis grown on the land to be sold through Jamaica's commercial market. This distinction is central to the review. Religious cultivation is connected to Rastafarian observance, worship, and community practices. Commercial cultivation, processing, retailing, research, and other industry activities fall under a separate licensing regime administered by the Cannabis Licensing Authority. Religious use versus commercial activity. The government says Jamaica's commercial cannabis industry remains regulated exclusively by the Cannabis Licensing Authority under the Dangerous Drugs Act and its accompanying regulations. Businesses participating in the regulated industry must obtain the appropriate license or authorization. Recognition as a religious organization, access to designated sacramental land, or involvement in Rastafarian worship does not automatically permit a person or organization to operate a commercial cannabis business. Government officials are concerned that uncertainty surrounding the sacramental framework could create opportunities for unauthorized cultivation, transportation, distribution, or sale. Authorities must therefore determine how cannabis, legitimately cultivated for religious purposes, can be tracked and protected without imposing measures that unreasonably interfere with worship. That will require clear rules regarding who may cultivate, how much may be grown, where the cannabis may be stored, how it can be transported, and the circumstances under which law enforcement officers may intervene. It will also require authorities to define evidence or documentation that recognized organizations and designated individuals may need when interacting with the police. The review comes amid long-standing complaints from members of the Rastafarian community that the legal protections introduced in 2015 have not always been applied consistently. Some Rastafarians have alleged that they continue to face arrest, prosecution, seizure of ganja, and disruption of religious practices, even when claiming protection under the sacramental provisions of the Dangerous Drug Act. The issue was highlighted recently in the case of Westmoreland resident Troy Harrison. Charges of possession of ganja and dealing in ganja were dropped after the Crown offered no evidence, reportedly on the basis that Harrison was a member of the Rastafarian community and was entitled to possess and use ganja for sacramental purposes. Attorney at law Marcus Goff, who represented Harrison, argued that members of the police force do not always have a consistent understanding of the religious protections created by the 2015 amendments. The concerns raised by Rastafarians present one side of the regulatory challenge. On the other side are concerns that persons could improperly claim religious protection to avoid the requirements governing commercial cannabis. The government is attempting to address both problems, the possible violation of legitimate religious rights and the possible misuse of those rights to conceal activities outside the law. The proposed transfer of administrative responsibility to the Ministry of Culture reflects the view that sacramental cannabis should be approached primarily as a matter of religious freedom and cultural heritage rather than commercial regulation. Ganja has held an important spiritual place within Rastafari for generations. It is used in some religious ceremonies, reasoning sessions, and communal observances, and is regarded by adherents as sacrament. Placing operational responsibility within the culture ministry could allow the framework to be managed alongside other policies dealing with Jamaica's religious traditions, cultural communities, and intangible heritage. The change could also create a clearer division of responsibilities. Under such an arrangement, the Culture Ministry could oversee the recognition of eligible religious organizations and sacramental places, while the Cannabis Licensing Authority would continue to regulate the commercial industry. The Justice Ministry and police would remain important to legal interpretation and enforcement. However, the government has not yet published a final administrative model, and it remains unclear whether a transfer would require amendments to legislation, new regulations, or changes to existing ministerial orders. The need for clear enforcement protocols. One of the most important outcomes of the consultations could be the development of standard enforcement procedures for the Jamaica Constabulary Force. Police officers need clear guidance on how to distinguish between lawful sacramental possession, general possession of small quantities, unauthorized cultivation, dealing and licensed commercial activity. Without consistent procedures, legitimate Rastafarian practitioners may face unnecessary intervention, while persons operating outside the law may attempt to exploit uncertainty. Government has indicated that stronger coordination is being considered among the responsible ministries, the Cannabis Licensing Authority, and the police. Public education may also be necessary. Many Jamaicans still misunderstand the difference between decriminalization and legalization. The 2015 reforms did not make all possession, cultivation, or sale of ganja lawful. Possession of small quantities was decriminalized, while religious, medical, therapeutic, scientific, and commercial activities are governed by separate legal provisions. Further consultations are expected before the government settles on a revised governance structure. The process will need to involve meaningful engagement with Rastafarian organizations because they are the community whose religious rights are directly affected. Cannabis regulators, law enforcement representatives, legal experts, and other stakeholders are also likely to play important roles. Several unanswered questions remain, including which body will have the final authority to recognize sacramental organizations? What standards will be used to establish that an organization is bona fide? How will cultivation and possession limits be determined? What documentation will be required when cannabis is transported? How will sacramental cannabis be prevented from entering the unlicensed market? What remedies will be available when recognized practitioners believe their rights have been violated? Will police officers receive specialized training under the revised framework? The answers will determine whether the new arrangements can deliver both religious protection and effective regulation. For the government, the challenge is to construct a system that does not treat Rastafarian worship as a commercial cannabis enterprise, while ensuring that religious protections cannot be used as a cover for illegal trade. For the Rastafarian community, the review represents an opportunity to secure clearer and more consistently applied recognition of rights that have already been established in law. The consultations are therefore about more than cannabis regulation. They also concern religious freedom, cultural recognition, law enforcement, and the relationship between the Jamaican state and a movement that has had profound influence on the country's identity and international image. Until the consultations are completed and the government announces its final decisions, the existing law and administrative arrangements remain in effect. Subscribe today, turn on notifications, and never miss the stories that matter most. Jamaica News Now, your Highlands, your news, right now.